How's it going, everyone? It's Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and let's talk about Shift and Slay. This is a new tactical RPG roguelike that I believe has a lot of potential, but as it stands right now, it's a bit light on content, and I would like to see some updates and gameplay changes before I fully recommend this title. The footage you're seeing that's running in the background is from one of my more successful runs, and I'm just going to let this play out while I discuss the positives and negatives of this game. I believe that it doesn't take long to see that the big draw to Shift and Slay is efficient slaying. Now that sounds weird, but it really does describe how this game wants you to operate. If you're going to be successful on any run, you have to chain actions together efficiently to get through these levels. You are limited in ammo, and it is recommended that you use every tool available to ensure that when you get to that final stage and you're standing in front of that boss, you have enough rounds to take out the boss and its adds, because if you don't, it's essentially the end of the run. If that sounds restrictive, it is, especially in the early goings, because you are limited to one loadout, which will grant you a total of 55 rounds and a limited amount of mines and special ammunition. You are also able to use the hack feature at the starting console that will grant you a random item, but all of that does not matter if you do not operate efficiently. Like all roguelikes, the first few rounds are all about trial and error. You are meant to experiment and die. Enemy placement in Shift and Slay is random, but you will notice that levels will repeat themselves through successive runs. And I thought for the most part that's fine, because it allows you to familiarize yourself with certain situations, which will allow you to become more efficient when navigating these levels. You're going to need to punch and utilize environmental hazards to successfully conserve ammo. You need to remind yourself that you are limited in the actions you can perform, but these actions do reset if you successfully kill an enemy. I think about by the time you go through your third or fourth run, you're going to be able to chain actions together to breeze through certain sections. You do, however, need to keep in mind that certain actions like shooting are limited, as you only start out with 2 rounds per turn. So if you happen to group up enemies and kill 2 of them with bullets, you will more than likely find yourself pinned, and this could potentially kill you because you take a lot of damage in this game. It is very satisfying, however, to line up enemies, punch one, push the other, shoot both in a row, and then repeat that action. I was having a really good time as soon as I got into the flow and had noticed that when you're efficiently slaying, this game can be a lot of fun. When you really start to understand what the game wants you to do and you really dig into the mechanics, runs may take you less than 30 minutes to complete. Boss fights in this game range from being really good to okay. All of them have a gimmick, and I really feel like the first boss fight is the most daunting because there are enemies that surround you that you'll have to take out as you're navigating the level, but once you really understand what the gimmick is of each boss fight, they become easier on subsequent tries. The second boss is okay. It's a 1v1, and I really think that while the game tries to make it seem daunting because they're an armored enemy, and I think their armor level is 3, they're really easy to manipulate into hazards to break their armor and also use physical attacks. The final boss, I felt it was just okay as long as you have ammo. Otherwise, there is really no point into facing them because their damage output is really high and you're more than likely going to be dead in a few shots. As you make your way to the final area, you'll eventually reach a location where you will be able to unlock new starting loadouts, and unlocking all of them requires you to reach that area again in a different run. You're going to notice that these new loadouts will feature new tools and special ammunition, which will allow you to further experiment in your run. I personally think that the second loadout is my favorite because I have more ammo, and I think that the tools are really solid for those of you who are defensive and like to play cautiously. If you believe for whatever reason that you just do not have enough health as you're playing through Shift and Slay, don't worry. The more enemies you kill will eventually grant you the award of being able to start with more health. And it's really interesting because it doesn't matter if you complete a run or not. The game just rewards you for playing, which I really appreciate because I know that there are a lot of people who are probably going to pick up this game and say to themselves, you just don't have enough health to get yourself all the way to the end, which is not true. Like I said, once you start to really play within the framework of the game and you try not to deviate too much, you will find yourself making it to the end almost every run. Now, as this is a roguelike, you are going to be given the ability to unlock buffs during your runs that will make things a lot easier on you. And these are going to come in the form of increasing strength, ammo capacity, movement, defense, and the ability to shoot enemies that show up in your line of sight as long as you have ammo that turn. Now, I don't think that there are any buffs that really stand out. There's nothing really crazy or unique. And I personally did not like the line of sight buff, primarily because it costs ammo. And if you shoot an enemy with armor, you are just wasting your shots and it can be really frustrating. I thought to myself when I first picked that buff that this was going to be great when taking on enemies with stronger weapons. But because that second area is filled with enemies that have armor, shooting an enemy will not decrease their armor. You have to physically attack them or knock them into an obstacle. So basically you're just shooting and only chipping away one health piece at a time, which can be really, really wasteful. I really hated that. That was the one thing where I was like, I am being punished for getting this buff, especially in an area that I thought I was just kind of walking through when I got to the end. But then when I started to fight the boss, I was like, there's no reason not to waste all of my ammunition on him right now, because if I have him walk in that line of sight, I'm going to fire at him. It's not going to do any damage, and I am just wasting ammunition from there. And because I needed that when I got to that final boss, I reached it and I was like, I have nothing left. This is the end for me. It was really frustrating because it was like the first run I had where I thought I was doing really well. And I just feel like that buff itself feels more like a punishment, even though it shouldn't be. But I will say that when you're able to acquire a buff like increasing your strength, which allows you to hit harder and push further, runs become a lot easier because you're going to be able to save ammo. And if you get that in conjunction with an increase in gun damage, you're practically unstoppable, because that slight increase to where it's like a +1 for punching and then +1 for gun damage will almost kill every non-armored enemy in this game. For those armored enemies, just kind of bait them into obstacles, hit them, push them, shoot them with a special ammo that's going to incapacitate them or stun them, and then repeat the process, and you'll get through that really easily. But I really felt you were unstoppable when you had certain buffs together, that it really made up for the fact that some buffs just, while helpful or while cool sounding, just really didn't help you as much as some of these normal buffs did. So once you start to get acclimated, and when things really start to flow and you understand how the mechanics work and you're working within the framework of the game, I think Shift and Slay is really enjoyable. I'm a big fan of tactical RPGs, and being able to figure out how to efficiently work through these levels was a lot of fun. But with that said, there is a noticeable lack of level variation. There are far too many levels in which enemy placement is noticeably similar, and while this is fine for early runs, it can become repetitive pretty quickly. And I found myself while I was playing through this game wondering if the levels might shift around. And I think that would add a new dynamic to these runs, but they don't. Obstacles generally stay in the same place, and as long as you maneuver outside of an enemy's attack range, it doesn't matter what their placement is, because you can just herd them into obstacles and chain attacks together. And I think a little bit more variation in regard to enemy placement and obstacle placement would go a long way in making runs feel fresh every time you go through. And this applies to the bosses as well. Fighting in the same arena under the same circumstances constantly doesn't require the player to change up their strategy. This is especially true for the second boss. It's a 1v1 and it looks difficult on the surface, but as I've stated earlier, it does not take much to bait the boss into an area in which you can exploit all the different obstacles to do consistent damage. I really think it's the easiest boss in the game, especially after that first boss where you can take a ton of damage and then he heals himself and you're just like, that is just frustrating to get through. How am I going to do this? You get to this second boss expecting something equally as challenging and you don't get that. I think some variation here with the boss fights would be a lot of fun. When it comes to overall content, Shift and Slay is light. There are only 3 areas, a handful of buffs, 3 loadouts, 3 bosses, and that's it. It does not take long to adapt to the game's mechanics, and I do think it's strange to not be able to push enemies into walls or indestructible obstacles. It's probably the one gameplay change I would like to see, but I understand why it is the way it is now, because I think it would make the game far too easy. But it is definitely weird when you're whittling down an enemy's health and you can't push them into a wall for any damage or push them off a ledge when it presents itself. I really feel like you should reward the player for lining enemies up in a certain way, and in this regard, it just feels restrictive. I don't know if any extra content is planned, but I do believe what is here is a good foundation. If the game gets content updates in the form of new enemies, buffs, and levels, I think Shift and Slay would be a good investment, because what is here as fun as long as you are playing within the game's framework. You really cannot deviate from its vision. Otherwise, you are going to find yourself struggling to get to the end. The game looks daunting at first because you have to conserve resources to make it through the 3 different areas with the different levels and a number of different enemies with different health pools, and your gun and strikes only do a certain amount of damage. There are no redos. Once you make a move in this game, you have to live with it, which is something I personally like because it forces the player to think strategically. A reckless player is a dead player, but once you acclimate to the mechanics, runs can unfortunately become really repetitive. I like Shift and Slay, but I can really only recommend this to hardcore strategy RPG fans who like roguelikes. And at this time, I think the game being light on content is going to be a turnoff regardless of the price point. I think roguelikes should be able to provide enough variation to keep a player engaged for long periods of times, even though it may be lacking in the total amount of levels you go through. Like I said, I really like the foundation and I want to recommend this game, but it's kind of difficult considering that there are going to be players who are going to want more content. They may see this as like an elongated demo, and I don't think that's what it is. I do think that the game requires you to constantly go through these different rotations, but you just don't have enough content to really keep you engaged. It's fun, but the lack of content is noticeable. And that's a shame because I do think what's here is good. And that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.